Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's event titled Responding to Religion in a Changing Workplace. I'm Sana Patel. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Tonight's event is a collaboration in the Visiting Distinguished Scholars series between the Boniek Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance, a research institute led by Elaine Howard Ecklund, that examines the conditions which lead to religious pluralism, tolerance, violence, and conflict, and the Baker Institute's Religion and Public Policy program, led by Michael Emerson, which examines how religion and culture inevitably affect our domestic and foreign public policies. On behalf of the Boniek Institute and the Religion and Public Policy program, I'd like to begin by expressing my special thanks to the Brian J. and June B. Zwan Endowment for funding this event. I'd also like to thank the teams at the Religion and Public Policy program and the Baker Institute for organizing and hosting, as well as the Boniek Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance for a dedicated outreach for this event. Finally, I'd like to thank our panelists and all of you, our guests, for joining us today in this discussion. Now, please allow me to introduce tonight's speakers and moderator. Elaine Howard Ecklund is the director of the Boniek Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance, the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences, and professor of sociology at Rice University. She is also a Rice faculty scholar at the Baker Institute. As a sociologist of religion, science, and work, she is particularly interested in social change and how institutions change, especially when individuals leverage aspects of their religious, race, and gender identities to change institutions. Denise Daniels is the Hudson T. Harrison Professor of Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. Denise regularly consults and provides executive coaching services and leadership development training in corporate contexts. Her primary scholarly interests are in the areas of meaningful work, Sabbath, leadership, gender, and motivation. Chris Scheitle is an associate professor of sociology at West Virginia University. Broadly speaking, his research examines the social dynamics of religion in the United States. More specifically, he studies how religion influences and is influenced by factors such as an individual's sexuality or exposure to science. He has also recently been conducting research on crimes against religious communities or individuals. Tonight's moderator is Rachel Schneider. She is an associate of academic programs at the Boniek Institute, director of the Religion and Public Life Center, and an assistant research professor in the Department of Religion here at Rice. Broadly, Rachel's research focuses on how religion can undergird systems of inequality, such as racial and gender inequality, but also how religion and spirituality can shape ethical and political practices and inspire social change. You can find out more about the speakers in the electronic program accessible via QR code. And now I turn it over to Elaine to begin tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's really, really wonderful to have you all here. Thank you to Sana for that lovely introduction. In the midst of all that is going on in our world, and especially on the anniversary of October 7th, you have my greatest thanks for being here. And I hope that you will find some kind of encouragement in this event, that this will be a time broadly of community building and challenge in the midst of our world. I want to argue that the workplace in the midst of these fraught times is a place we need to really turn to, a place we need to examine if we want to understand what it really means to get along with each other while expressing our deepest differences, what, in effect, a healthy religious pluralism really looks like. I want to express some thanks as well. This is a book release event, and it has 3 authors, and I am deeply, deeply thankful to my co-authors, Dr. Daniels and Dr. Scheitle. But never are these things done by just 1, 2, or 3 people. There's always a community of scholars behind them. And so I wanted to introduce you to our over 20-person team at the Baniak Institute, many of whom were deeply involved in the research, really the 5 years of research that made this book possible, and just incredibly, incredibly grateful. I see some folks who were involved in the early years here, and it just really warms my heart to have you here. This is also part of the Zwan Distinguished Scholar Series, which my colleague Michael Emerson and I are now directing. And I'm super happy to be reinvigorating this series in partnership with the Baker Institute. Also grateful to the Religion and Public Life Center, and of course my own Baniak Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance. A few comments about the big picture. So what we're going to try to convince you of tonight is that the workplace provides special kinds of opportunities for religious pluralism that really aren't present in any other spaces in society. We're also going to talk about how people want to express their faith at work. Often we think that people want to remain privatized about their faith, but we're going to show you some data and make some arguments that people actually want to express their faith more. We're also going to talk about calling and what it means to be spiritually called, and the literature that shows that people who feel called to their work actually do better work. We are also going to talk in a very upfront way about religious discrimination, the ways in which religious discrimination overlaps with other kinds of discrimination like racial discrimination and gender discrimination and sexuality discrimination, and the ways in which religious discrimination really needs to be recognized in its own terms. And we're going to end up, true to our location here tonight in the Baker Institute, to talk about some practices and some policies that really need to catch up to the current realities. Okay, are you with me? All right. So here's some of the data. I know I get really excited about data. I say, are you with me? And then the next slide, very next slide is like, here's the data, but I'm a researcher. So for the past 5 years, we have been working on a pretty big data collection. So we did a nationally representative survey of over 15,000 people that we collected in partnership with a Gallup polling organization, one of our nation's top polling organizations. We also followed up this nationally representative survey with lots and lots of interviews, nearly 300 interviews. We interviewed those who took our survey and are workers or looking for work. We did in-depth interviews with people from different religious traditions. We did what's called oversamples. We sampled a greater proportion of people than is present in the general population of Muslims and people who are Jewish. But we also sampled all traditions of Christianity, as well as people who are non-religious, and particularly people who see themselves as spiritual but not religious. We also did in-depth interviews with religious leaders because we wanted to try and figure out what religious leaders are talking about in their congregations, in their religious organizations related to the workplace. And because Spanish is one of the dominant languages in the U.S. outside of English, we also conducted our interviews if people needed to do them in Spanish as well as in English. Here's some thoughts on religious polarization and pluralism. So people want to display their faith at work. For example, in religious organizations, people actually work in religious organizations, that proportion who want to display or wear items that represent their faith at work is very high. I've given this material to religious leaders in different talks, and the response I get is not 71% is so high. The response I get is, what are those other 29% of people doing? Like, why? How are they working in a religious organization and they don't want to display or wear items representing their faith or spirituality? But that's for another talk. You see that a third of people in more caretaking and service kinds of industries, and it gets quite low in the legal arena and in life, physical, and social sciences. We also know that people experience discrimination, and there's a proportion of people who even say that they're denied employment due to their religious or non-religious identity. There's an appreciable minority of people who are Muslim who say that they're denied employment due to their religious or non-religious identity, and there's a smaller proportion of other religious traditions, but even an appreciable minority of those traditions as well. But we also know that workplaces, and we heard this over and over again in those nearly 300 interviews that we conducted, that workplaces are still places where people meet people who are different from one another, that they're actually one of the only places, the only sectors in society where people meet people who are different from one another. We often send our children to schools with other people who are like us. We go to religious organizations with other people who are like us. We funnel into universities with other people who are like us often. But in our workplaces, there's still a matter of diversity in our workplaces, and people are exposed in their workplaces. We heard this over and over, and we show this through our survey results. People are exposed to people who are different from them. And so that then means workplaces are places where we ought to be attentive to religious differences and think of workplaces as a type of place in society where we can begin to learn how to really practice a healthy religious pluralism. Here's just one quote from a woman we interviewed who's a Muslim, who says that in her work in the pharmaceutical industry, she's taught her Christian colleagues the things that I do in my religion of Islam, and that they have taught me a lot too. And we had an hour interview with her about the things that those groups have taught one another, which was really heartening for us. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Denise Daniels, to talk about how people express faith at work.
I'm going to need the clicker. So I'm going to actually talk about two things. I'm going to talk about how people express their faith at work, and then I'm also going to talk a little bit about how people experience calling in the context of their work. So one of the things that we were curious about was, to what extent and how do people engage or express their faith commitments in the workplace? And we found that there were 4 or 5 different ways that they do this, but including things like wearing or displaying religious items. Elaine already talked a little bit about that. People also talk with others about their religious commitments. That's one of the ways that they express their faith. People may need to take time off of work in order to observe religious holidays. It's one of the ways that they communicate their faith commitments to others. And then a number of private practices, things like prayer, and even small group kinds of activities that they might do in the workplace. So we were looking at this and kind of curious about how these expressions related to other kinds of outcomes in the workplace. And what we found was a couple of kind of positive connections with the ways that people engage or express their faith at work and some outcomes in the workplace. So individuals who display or wear items at work that represent their faith or spirituality are more likely to say that they're very satisfied with their jobs compared to people who are not communicating or expressing their faith in this particular way. Similarly, people who say that they feel comfortable talking about their faith at work are more likely to say that they feel a strong sense of commitment to the organization that they work for. Now, these are correlational data. These were measured at the same time, so we're measuring both the levels of commitment and job satisfaction at the same time we're asking about these expressive practices, but it is suggestive. It's suggestive to us that there's a relationship here, there's a connection here that is important and that is meaningful. So we were also kind of curious about how common this is for people to express their faith at work. And so what we found was just over 1 in 5 workers say that they're motivated to talk about their faith or spirituality with people at work. But that changes pretty dramatically depending on particular faith tradition. And so when you look at evangelical Protestant Christians, for example, over half of them say that they are motivated to talk about their faith with people at work. Obviously, this is a much higher percentage than the 22% on average, and it's the highest of any of the religious traditions that we looked at. But we also found differences between people based on other demographic characteristics. And so, for example, 36% of black workers compared to 26% of white workers say that they feel motivated to talk to others about their faith while at work. So there's a huge range here. There's a range of what people are comfortable with, and part of what determines what people are comfortable is a number of of characteristics, including religious traditions specifically and other kinds of demographic characteristics. Why not? Why don't people express their faith at work? And you probably could come up with all sorts of reasons, but we talked to folks who gave us reasons. So there was one particular person who expressed a fear of judgment or conflict if he were to talk about faith in the workplace. He says, I don't really speak about religion because I'm not trying to offend someone. I know now in the world, if you say something about some religion, it's a very sensitive topic in public. So I'd rather choose not to say anything about it. And this is somebody who's in tech support. He's a young man, 20 years old, an evangelical Christian. So in spite of the fact that over half of our evangelical population said that they were interested in talking about their faith in the workplace, he's like, I'm not sure about that. And similarly, we had people responding to us some sense that there should be a separation between faith and the workplace. In fact, we had several people talk about kind of separation of church and state. Well, this is clearly not. We're not talking about separation of church and state in the workplace, but that was the phrase that people would sometimes use. And we had one particular man who was a dual career person. He was a truck driver, but he also was an evangelical pastor. And so on the weekends, he would pastor a small church, and during the week, he was driving a truck. And he had this real clear sense that those two domains were very separate. He said, the purpose of the workplace is to make money. The church is the place to worship and express your faith. And so he wasn't interested in talking in the workplace so much about his faith, or he had concerns about expressing his faith in the context of work. So there's a number of reasons that people would maybe avoid that or not engage in that. One of the other topics that we were really interested in was this notion of calling and the extent to which people see their work as a calling. And in order to kind of assess this, we were trying to figure out how we would sort of measure calling. But one of the things we did in the survey was we simply asked people, to what extent do you view your work as a spiritual calling? And what we found was that only about a fifth of workers view their work as a spiritual calling. So, 80% of people basically said, I don't think of my work as a spiritual calling. But once again, there are differences here based on demographics. And so women were more likely than men at about a 2-to-1 ratio to say that they felt like their work was a calling. So this was kind of interesting to us, looking at some of these demographics. We also found that a sense of calling declines with increasing income. So the more money you make, the less you have a sense that your work is a calling. And we thought about, why this is, and we struggled with trying to figure out what was going on here. And one of the conjectures that we have is there is a little bit of a cognitive trade-off that people are making. So as you're making more money, maybe there's a sense of, well, I must be doing it for the money. It must not be because of intrinsic reasons. Or maybe another way to think of that is, if you're not making very much money, I must be doing it because it's a calling. So there's this sense of, maybe the reason I'm doing it is because I'm not making so much money. And then we also found that evangelicals had a higher sense, or more likely to report a sense of calling, than mainline Protestants and Catholics. So even within the Christian faith tradition, there was quite a range of variable responses among people in terms of their sense of calling. So when we started to do interviews, we started asking people about this notion of calling and what it meant, and whether or not they experienced it and what that meant to them. And what we found was that there were two dimensions that people started talking about calling on the basis of. So I'm going to talk about these two dimensions, and then I'm going to talk about how they combine. The first dimension was this notion of intrinsic or extrinsic to the work. In other words, sometimes people would say, my work is a calling because there's something about the work itself that is really meaningful, either to me or to something. And so the work that I am doing is in and of itself meaningful. There's something bound up in the work that makes it feel like it's a sense of calling. And then other people would say things like, well, it's not the work itself, but this work allows me to do something else that feels very important to me. So we labeled those as more extrinsic to the work itself. So that was one dimension, whether or not people felt like their calling was bound up in the work, or whether it was somehow extrinsic to the work and the work itself was a means to an end. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension that people tended to talk about when we asked them about whether or not their work was a calling had to do with where the location of who was being served by whatever work that they were doing. And so some people would talk, and we label this proximal and distal. If you're not an academic, you can just think of this as near and far. If you're an academic, proximal and distal will work. But the proximal notion is this idea that somehow the work that I'm doing, it is meaningful very close to me, maybe inside of me, or maybe right around me with the people that I'm engaging with, whereas distal is kind of out there. My work is meaningful because it's impacting somebody down the road. but it's not immediately bound up in me necessarily. And so what we can do is we can cross these two dimensions. And so you can envision like a vertical and a horizontal, and you end up with 4 different quadrants. And each of these quadrants has kind of a different approach to thinking about calling, a different notion of what calling is or might be. And I want to be clear here that these are not necessarily unique dimensions. In other words, you might actually have both a proximal and a distal sense of your work as calling. You might have both an intrinsic and an extrinsic sense of calling. So you could possibly locate yourself in all 4 of the dimensions that I'm going to identify here in just a second. But as people were talking about it, we got a sense that most of them found themselves in 1 or 2 of those dimensions. But again, they don't have to be mutually exclusive from each other. They can be overlapping. So the first dimension that I want to talk about is the notion that the work is both intrinsic and proximal, that the meaning of the work is found, or the calling is found both in an intrinsic and a proximal way. And here we labeled this work as a blessing from God. And people would say things like, God directed me to this work, or I was made for this work. Those were the kinds of statements that people would make when they had this sense of calling being both intrinsic and proximal. So we had one woman who was a corporate trainer. And she said to us, for many decades, I have believed that one of my purposes on the earth is just to help people. God has given me a gift to teach and to train. And so obviously this is the job where the job title is trainer. Being at this job, it allows me to do what I do well, which is to train and to educate. So you can see this sense of it's intrinsic. It's bound up in the work itself. It's important, and it's very proximal. It's all about her. It's inside of her that she's expressing these talents and so on. The second dimension is the intrinsic and distal, or not dimension, the second quadrant is the intrinsic and distal dimension. And this is the idea that the work that someone is doing is serving the common good. And so we would have people say things like, what I make or what I do helps people out there. And we had one guy, he was actually really fascinating. He worked at a Subway restaurant. And he said, the fact that it's Subway, it's vegetables and food and stuff that people can conceivably be nourished by, and it's located in some of the toughest regions in the world. And they feed a lot of people every day. I definitely did consider that, and definitely considered, does that line up? Does that track with what I'm called upon to do by the Gospels? So this guy's really clearly thinking about his faith in the context of Subway and saying, hey, my work here impacts people out there. It's helping the world in a very positive way because we're giving them nourishing food. And so you can start to see how people are conceptualizing calling in these various ways. The third way that people talked about calling was the combination of extrinsic and proximal. And the idea, again, extrinsic is it's not about the work itself. So that means it could be any job. Like the job itself doesn't really matter. Any job could allow you to do whatever it is that you're doing or whatever it is that feels meaningful. And then proximal is close to you, typically in the workplace or within the context of the work you're doing. And so we would have people saying things like, at my job, I can serve other people. At my job, the people, I can help the people that I interact with at work, or I can share my faith at work. And so this is where we saw people talking about proselytizing as a sense of calling in their workplace, was this extrinsic proximal quadrant. But it wasn't just about proselytizing. It was really more focused on how do I serve people in my workplace. And so we had one guy who was working as in a kind of a supervisory position at a fruit packing plant. And he was telling us, people at the packing house, they have a nickname for me. They call me Yoda. And it's like they come to me if they have a problem. And even the people who don't believe in God do that. And so I've met with this one guy for, it's been about 4 weeks, trying to help him get reconciled with his wife. Now, this has nothing to do with fruit packing, right? This could be any job. And that's the point. That's the extrinsic kind of notion. It's about him and his engagement and relationship with people at work. So it's proximal in that sense. But it could be any job that he's engaging in these kinds of relationships with. And he feels that a sense of calling because he's called to his coworkers in that way. And then the last quadrant is we call serving others beyond work. This is the extrinsic and distal. And this is where people talked about their job providing resources that they can use for other purposes that they find meaningful. So this is not about the job itself. It's not about the particular tasks that you're doing. It's extrinsic to the work. And it's distal, so it's not even about the workplace. It's kind of out there someplace. And we had one guy who kind of exemplified this. In fact, when we first talked to him about whether or not he thought his work was a calling, he said it wasn't. And then the more we talked, he started saying, he said, well, my job, it provides a means. We tithe. So anything I do at work, in turn, helps my church or any other organizations that we wish to give to. So I guess indirectly that is somewhat of a calling. Man, I never thought of that before. Like he's kind of processing as we're having this conversation, and he's realizing, actually, I do experience my work as a calling, but it's not because of the work. It's because of what my work allows me to do in a totally different domain. It's about the church. It's about other places that we can give to, and so on. So overall, we had a number of really interesting conversations with folks about this experience of calling. We were able to kind of identify these different ways that people think about their work as calling. And then we were also thinking through, to what extent, remember I said earlier that only 1 in 5 people say that their work is experienced as a calling. And so we were thinking, what are ways that we maybe could enhance the experience, or maybe that organizations could help their workers enhance their experience of calling. And then we also started thinking through this idea that or maybe asking the question of, is calling always a good thing? Is it a universal positive? And I have a picture up here of an article that we actually published recently in The Conversation, which is titled, Thinking About Work as a Calling Can Be Meaningful, but There Can Be Unexpected Downsides as Well. And I want to start with the meaningful, and then I want to talk about some of the potential downsides. So what we did see is that viewing work as a spiritual calling is associated with greater job satisfaction. So it's kind of similar to the expression of faith concepts that I was talking about a few minutes ago. But people who said, yes, my job I experience as a spiritual calling, also said that they were satisfied with their work. They also had a higher sense of commitment to their organization. So generally, pretty positive. Another interesting finding that we had was that if people felt like they were experiencing discrimination of any kind in the workplace, if they also had a sense of calling, the relationship between their experience of discrimination and their job satisfaction was kind of ameliorated. In other words, typically when people experience discrimination at work, they're not very satisfied with their work. But people who have a sense of calling can experience discrimination at work and then also still experience satisfaction at work because of this sense of calling. Now, that's a double-edged sword, right? That's one of those phenomenon where, is it a good thing that they're experiencing a sense of calling? Well, probably, but there's also a downside to it, which is they may not be as attuned to some of the experiences of discrimination, and they may not be attentive to the ways that other people may be experiencing discrimination. And so that was the final finding that we had kind of in this area, is that feeling called to your work can blind yourself to some of the difficulties that other people experience at work. In other words, if you're thinking about your work in a very positive way, if you're experiencing it, that it's a sense of calling and that there's something meaningful to you about it, you may not be noticing the ways in which other people are struggling with their work, and particularly those 80% of people who are not experiencing their work as calling. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to talk a little bit more about discrimination and accommodation. And I will for sure leave you the clicker.
So as Denise mentioned, one reason why some folks are hesitant to express their faith in the workplace is a concern of being sort of judged or harassed or discriminated against, which ties to a natural concern more broadly about what are the potential negative effects of or pitfalls of having religion in the workplace. Before our study, there are some existing sources of data about religious discrimination. So, for instance, like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission publishes reports every year about the number of official complaints of discrimination based off different categories. And so in most years, there's about 2,000 to 4,000 sort of what they call charges or complaints of religious discrimination per year. Although, as an interesting sort of factoid, this would be a weird trivia question, but in 2022, this actually shot up to over 20,000 complaints that were tied to COVID vaccine mandates. And so that was an exception. But in most years, it's about 2,000 to 4,000 official complaints. But of course, those official numbers are going to be really restricted. We know that most people, whether you're talking about religious discrimination or racial discrimination or sex discrimination or whatever it might be, most people who feel like they've experienced that are not going to pursue official reports or legal action. In fact, in a different project that Elaine and I did, we found that only about 13% of people who say they've experienced religious discrimination say that they've pursued it in any way, in any sort of official capacity. So, and that's in line with what we find with other forms of discrimination as well, that the vast majority of people do not pursue any sort of path for that. Elaine actually had a slide that showed another previous study that we had where we asked individuals, do you feel like you've ever been denied employment, or do you feel like you've ever been received an unfair work evaluation because of your religion or non-religion? In that study, we found that overall about 3% of U.S. adults say that they've been denied employment because of their religion, and about 4% say that they've received an unfair work evaluation, which again, those numbers feel kind of low, but remember, most people are not going to know if they've been denied employment because of their religion, right? Like, it would be unusual in many cases for you to even know that that is why you were denied employment. And those are very narrow, specific forms of discrimination. You might think of those as kind of the more extreme, obvious forms of religious discrimination. A lot of other forms are going to be much more interpersonal, much more subtle, and what you might think of as unfair treatment more broadly. In fact, that's essentially what we asked in this study. We asked people, do you feel like you've ever been treated unfairly at work because of your religion or non-religion? And what we find is that overall 31% of workers believe that they have experienced this to some extent. For instance, one individual that we interviewed who was a convert to Islam talked about how after she converted, her workplace, she described in troubling detail, almost systematic sort of harassment that she received both from coworkers and even her boss. She told us about how in one meeting that her boss had called, the boss had sort of stood up and sort of started saying negative things about this person's new religion. This rate, this 31% who say that they've received unfair treatment due to their religion or non-religion is much higher among Jewish and Muslim workers. As you see here, 55% of Jewish workers and 65% of Muslim workers report some sort of unfair treatment due to their religion. You also see on the far side over there that evangelical Protestants are also relatively high at 38%. Now, in our sort of more advanced statistical analyses, we find that there, in addition to religious tradition, so whether you're Jewish or Muslim or evangelical or whatever it might be, we find a few other sort of predictors of being more likely to say you've been a victim of unfair treatment due to your religion. So one is sort of religiosity, like how strongly do you identify as a religious person, and also religious expression. We ask questions about like how often do you wear religious symbols or talk about religion in the workplace, and all of those are predictive of experiencing religious unfair treatment due to your religion, which makes a lot of sense. It's almost like exposure and risk, right? That the more you're talking about this, the more you expose yourself to this possibility. We also find, all else being equal, that younger workers and more educated workers are actually more likely to say that they have experienced unfair treatment due to their religion or non-religion. We suspect that, it is somewhat speculative, but we suspect that this could be a function of younger workers and more educated workers having more of a language to talk about and recognize religious discrimination. It's more on their radar, essentially. And as I already showed on the other slides, that we find these religious tradition differences as well. Now, on the other side, who is less likely to say that they've experienced unfair treatment due to religion? Now, I need to emphasize that this is what we always say in statistics, all else being equal. So in other words, if we can find people who are the same religious tradition, the same level of religiosity, same education, etc., we find that all that being equal, that women and non-white workers are less likely to say they've received unfair treatment due to their religion. However, in the real world, not the statistical world, in the real world, women and non-white workers on average tend to be more religious on that side, which means that overall they actually experience more in sort of real life, if that makes sense. I also want to emphasize here that for the purposes of asking survey questions, we often have to ask individually, have you experienced discrimination due to your religion? But religious discrimination is not sort of isolated from other forms of discrimination. And so we actually ask questions on our survey about, have you also experienced racial discrimination or gender discrimination and so forth? And what we find is that these different forms of discrimination are often tied into each other. So individuals who say they've experienced religious discrimination at work are often more likely to say, I've also experienced other forms of religious discrimination. There's different reasons for that. Some of it might be that, again, once you've been discriminated against at one time, it's on your radar for the future, so it's for other instances that might happen. The other thing, though, is that religious discrimination and the factors that relate to it can overlap with other categories. So, for instance, if a religious tradition sort of warrants certain garments or indicators of religion for a particular sex or gender, then that can put that particular group at a higher risk. So these categories overlap with each other. So one idea that you might have is, well, why don't we just sort of hide our faith, right? Hide religion in the workplace, and that might solve all this problem. In fact, we asked on our survey if individuals agree that they conceal their religion in the workplace out of concern for what other people think. And we found that 16% of workers say, yes, I do conceal my faith in the workplace. So for instance, one person we interviewed said, if I wear my religion as a badge on my shoulder, it'll rub somebody the wrong way, so why would I do that? So even though this idea of concealing as a strategy feels like, oh, that makes sense, there's a few problems with it. One is that not everybody can conceal their religion, right? If you're a part of a tradition that's more visible, then, or you're part of a tradition that requires certain practices or accommodations, it's not always possible to conceal that, right? Another problem is that concealing your faith in the workplace leads to this culture of religion being invisible in the workplace, which then just kind of fuels this cycle. So, for instance, this Jewish woman that we interviewed told us how her workplace seemed fairly welcoming. And they said, they've always told me you're free to practice your religion, but because she never saw anybody else doing it, right? Like everybody else was essentially concealing their faith, she didn't feel comfortable practicing her faith, right? So again, the more people conceal, the more it fuels this kind of culture of invisibility. The other problem with concealment as a strategy is, and we know this from a lot of other social science research, is that it often begins with a desire of a person to belong to a group, right? The idea is I'm going to hide this part of myself because I want to belong, feel better part of this group. But what it actually ends up doing, and again, there's a lot of research that shows this, not just with religion, but with racial identity or sexuality or whatever it might be, that concealment actually ends up fueling less belonging to that group, which makes a lot of sense, because if you are feeling like you have to hide some important part of yourself, that's not going to lead you to feeling attached to a particular group. And this leads us to this idea of accommodation, because the sort of most baseline thing that a workplace can do to try to address this issue of this culture of invisibility is to actively accommodate workers' religious practices and religious faith. One Muslim woman that we spoke to recounted to us how the active approach that her workplace took to accommodations was really beneficial. She says that they told her, if you ever do prayers or anything, feel free to go to the third room. It can be your space. You can leave your mat in there. And she highlighted that this is very, very accommodating and created this culture where she felt like she could communicate basically any needs that she would want. We asked in our survey if workers had a sense of what accommodations, religious accommodations, were available to them in their workplace. And we found that 31% know what kinds of religious accommodations they work for offers, which if you sort of inverse that, right, that means that the 2/3 roughly don't know, right? They don't have any clue. And this actually came out a lot in our interviews, that folks had no idea what policies were in place in their workplace. And some actually didn't even know that this was a thing, that religious accommodations was an option, and legally an option. One evangelical woman that we interviewed said, I wanted to do either the Bible study or prayer group during lunchtimes, but I wasn't sure the policy for that. If those policies were more well known, I would have felt more comfortable. So again, going back to the previous quote, being forthright and active in letting workers know what is available and what workplaces can offer can go a long ways to creating a better culture. So That's one takeaway, but to turn over to the other big takeaways, I'll hand it back to Elaine.
Thank you, Chris. So we want to leave you with something to chew on and something to do. So we want leaders in particular to spend more time in our increasingly diversifying society, really focusing on those from minority traditions. There are, especially in some industries like the technology industry, increasing numbers of workers who are from Muslim, from Hindu, from Buddhist, and other minority traditions. And we found over and over that workers from these traditions wondered whether they have equal kinds of opportunities to express their faiths at work as do Christian workers and non-religious workers. So it's very important to care for these communities. We also want you to think more about focusing on the minorities, in particular the racial minorities within majority traditions. We found in our study that Black and Hispanic workers in particular are likely to be Christians, that the proportion of Christians within those particular racial and ethnic groups is overrepresented. It's much larger than the general population. Folks who are Black and Hispanic Christians are also particularly likely to talk about their faith at work. And I think you're getting this from the kind of data we presented, they are also particularly susceptible to experiencing what we call a kind of double marginalization, where they are discriminated against because they are both racial and religious minorities, and sometimes they can't tell which one it is. They just feel like they're discriminated against all the time. There are regional and industry differences. We've given you just a taste of that here, and there's quite a bit more about that in the book. And we think that leaders in particular and organizations should be attentive to what research shows about their industry. Is your industry one where there is likely to be a particularly large proportion of those from minority religious traditions in the U.S., or a particularly large proportion of non-religious people, or a particularly large proportion of Christians? We have data about that in the book, and I think it's important to think about that. Who counts as a minority is also going to really differ depending on what region you are in the country. So within the American South, for example, there's a higher proportion of Christians. Within the American Northwest, for example, and the Northeast, there's a very low proportion of Christians. And so whether or not you're the minority, even though you're part of the majority tradition within the U.S. as a whole, you can feel very much like a minority if you're in a particular region of the country. And workplace leaders need to be attentive to these kinds of dynamics. We talked some about calling, and a very, very important concept. It's very powerful. It makes people loyal. It makes people love their work. Those who feel called, for example, are more likely to be satisfied with their work. And there are ways we talk about in our book that workplace leaders can really foster opportunities to feel called in very sensitive and pluralistic and nuanced ways. But there are downsides to calling. It is easier, for example, to get people to work long hours, to get people to feel like they can't take breaks from their work, they can't complain about discrimination if they feel called. They can then turn their head the other way about difficult work environments because the work is so incredibly important. You think about jobs like teaching and other kinds of jobs that we heard this a lot from people who serve others through their work, often feel very deeply called to their work, but have a hard time complaining about difficult work conditions. So leaders really ought to be attentive to these kinds of things, especially in those types of industries where people are likely to feel called into that work. I also want our leaders to think about policies, and especially in this robust environment of our own Baker Institute for Public Policy. We really want to see workplace leaders and organizations bring religion to the table of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Religion has been treated really as a missing dimension of diversity. And as we show, religion really overlaps with other kinds of diversity. It's not as if we can have these separate silos of diversity that are not connected to one another. We are whole people, and we embody multiple identities, and religion religion overlaps with our ethnic heritage, with our racial classification often, with our gender. And it's very important to see religion as part of that whole conversation. And again, to see that in a very nuanced and a place of deep concern. We also need to understand that religion, as we said, overlaps with other kinds of discrimination. And here are some very practical kinds of things that I think leaders can do. Firstly, we really want you to examine your accommodation policies. We often found that that leaders didn't even know what kinds of religious accommodation policies they needed to be upholding as a matter of the law. These, in one sense, are legal matters. But beyond that, we want you to, even before it gets to a legal matter, to think about how you can proactively provide accommodation for people that work for you or work with you. So what can you do to look out for those who might be particularly minoritized in your particular industry or in your region? And once you provide the policies and you're proactive about it, to really make sure that workers understand accommodation policies. We found it shocking in some ways that such a large proportion of people that we studied didn't even know what workplace religious accommodation policies there were. And another kind of bottom line is to understand in a very deep sense that people want to bring their whole selves to work. I think that especially our younger workers are teaching us that people do not want to check pieces of their identity, of their selves at the door. That does not actually help them do better work. People do better work and more thoughtful work when they can bring their whole selves to work. And religion is very much a part of that for many people in the United States. We do not think that subverting religion is the answer. I think Chris showed that nicely in his proportion of the presentation, that subverting religion actually makes people feel like, just like subverting other kinds of identities, makes people feel like they really don't belong in the end, and actually prevents them from doing their best work. And we want you to see that the workplace is really a place for a kind of practice of healthy religious pluralism. It's perhaps one of the remaining places where we can practice that robustly in a time in our society where a healthy religious pluralism is so very deeply, deeply needed. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have move into a time of some questions from the audience for the next 20, 25 minutes. And then after you show us your best questions, then we'll end. And I think some of you know we have provided some copies of our book for you to take home with you as a small token of our appreciation for coming to the event tonight. And just if I may put in a little shameless plug, we hope that you will read the book, most importantly, and be in dialogue with us about it. And secondarily, it's really helpful to authors if you rate the book wherever you rate books, like on Amazon or Goodreads or something like that, which I hope you will do. So now some time for questions. So I'm going to make
so I'm happy to help moderate this conversation and questions. I already see hands raised, so I'm sure you're very eager to discuss this exciting research. Just a note to the audience, we probably have a lot of questions, so remember that a question is something that ends with the upward intonation of your voice. You may be likely and want to share your personal stories on these issues, and we of course invite you to talk with the authors about those afterwards. But okay, I see one here in the middle.
18% of workers belong to unions. In what field religion at work relates to the union phenomenon?
I don't think we have
Can I assign people to answer that?
Sure. Do what you want.
Because I don't want that one.
Well, I will say that you do have a lot of data to go back to
By
this,
industry.
and also double-edged sword.
Yeah, that's right.
And about wanting to create change in your organization.
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's not something that we examined head on. So we don't really have a great sense of how unionization connects with religious expression in the workplace. What we do have is data across industries. So we do know what industries people are more likely to be expressive of their faith, and that is going to correlate to some extent with union membership. So we could get at it in that way. I don't know if you want to say anything else, either of you.
I don't know if I have data points on this, but I will just say as a broad point that we know that religion has historically been a very powerful mobilization and social movement framing. And so I don't know from this project if we have any insight on whether or not unions are using that as a mobilization or organizational tactic. But it definitely historically has proven to be a powerful strategy. And so it could be. I could see that being a path.
You could envision somebody using a justice argument from a religious tradition to make a case in a union context, for example.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay. In the front, and then we'll go back to you.
I want to thank you all for sharing. You brought up how work environments are great for religion, right? Religion shouldn't trump humanity in an egalitarian way of running a business. Is there any discussion or any place that I can go to learn about the intersectionality between this newfound religion in the context of a workplace and also power imbalance that may take place? Because, you know, there's a difference between self-expression and somebody in a position of power imposing something.
Oh, that's such a good point. So I remember do you remember we did this interview with a corporate executive who said he was a Christian, and he said, I work with a group of people who are incredibly religiously diverse. I work with people who are non-religious. I work with people who are Hindus and Jewish and Muslim. And he said they don't mind at all when I have them pray in the morning and read the Bible with me. He said everyone is so receptive to it. And
When you're the CEO, you can say those things.
And we were like, oh yeah, I bet they're receptive to it. Yeah, right? Of course, you can't say that as a researcher, right? We're there just to listen. But the issue of power and power imbalance, especially positional power, like a CEO has over the people, and in this case it was a man, over the people that work for him, really needs to be taken into consideration. And that's one of the things you heard us say nuanced religious accommodation a lot. That's one of the things that we talk about a lot in the book is figuring out how to do this in particular when you're in a situation where you are the one in power, what that means, and you're not the one in power and what that means. And these things can definitely be, religious expression can be used as a negative tool to wield power. And I think it's very, very important to recognize that and to try to mitigate it. I don't think the answer is suppression, but I think rather it's very thoughtful accommodation, and the kind of accommodation that has accountability to look out for those who have the least power.
I want to add one thing to what Elaine just said, and that interview was notable partly because it was kind of comical, but also because it was a little bit of an outlier in a good way. And what I mean by that is that most people were actually very attuned to the fact that they might be in positions of power and wanting to be careful about how they engaged with people who might have less power than they did in the workplace with respect to this topic. So I do think it is something that most people are aware of. It certainly can be abused. It certainly is abused. But I think that the fact that it could be abused is not an argument for trying to get rid of it. I think it's an argument for nuance in the ways that we accommodate.
I noticed in your discussion on the positional quadrants that all of your quotes were from evangelicals. Yeah. Is that, any comments on that? I mean, I know they're anecdotal.
Yeah, they are anecdotal.
Is this a language that has developed more in the evangelical community than in others?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the answer is yes and. So yes, when we asked people to what extent do you experience your work as a spiritual calling, our evangelical Christian respondents were much higher than other groups to say, oh, yes, I'm experiencing it this way. And partly that's just a function of the language and the ways that evangelical Christians in particular are taught to think about work. So that was a piece of it. But as we were talking to people, and even the fourth guy that I was quoting from, he initially said, it's not a calling. My work is not a calling. But by the end, he comes back around to saying, actually, maybe it is a calling. And so when we talked to people using that framework, which really doesn't use the language of calling, it's more purpose driven. So you're thinking about the purpose of your work serving people proximally and distally and so on. You can use that language across any or no religious context. And people did seem to resonate with those concepts as opposed to the specific language of calling. So on the one hand, yes, evangelicals are much more likely to talk about their work as calling. On the other hand, almost everybody we talked to was able to kind of start to conceive of themselves in one of those quadrants, whether or not they thought of themselves as having a calling, which was kind of an interesting way to start to think about calling potentially. Now, there's obviously a huge literature on calling that's independent of this, but it was an interesting connection, maybe bridge to some of that.
And we were surprised at the extent to which not a majority, but a strong minority, something like over 20% of non-religious people also see their work as a spiritual calling.
Yeah.
So in the U.S. at least, it is a language that's available to a wide range of people, whether or not they are religious in a Christian tradition. So that was interesting to us.
And I guess the last thing on that is your observation is correct that all 4 examples were evangelicals. It didn't have to be. So there were people outside of the evangelical tradition who also could have identified themselves in those quadrants we could have pulled quotes from.
Okay, back here, and then we'll kind of circle our way back around to here. So at the very top.
Okay, so I have 2 questions, and they might be related, but I'm going to start with the one and then go to the next one. So you talk about accommodation and how people feel about expressing their religiosity at work. But how about their peers and colleagues? When they hear or when they feel, what is the perception of peers when people are expressing religion and they feel uncomfortable? They might feel uncomfortable. Can you talk about that?
Do you want to take that on? Or Chris?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at least in the context of like the survey data is hard to get how other people around because you're asking this person, right? And so you don't have the survey responses of people around them. But I mean, definitely in the interviews, people talked about a general like at least some people talked about a general unease or discomfort with religion around, right? Because it's one of those things that I think a lot of people are socialized to think we don't talk about that, and so if it comes up, it's like, even if they're not offended, it's like, like there's like kind of a visceral maybe reaction to that. But I think again, some of this is because there's kind of this, as I said, culture of like invisibility or concealment. I think that fuels that I think the more that people see expression, the more they are exposed to it and become more comfortable with, you have this display on your office cubicle or whatever it might be. So yeah, I guess that would be my response to that.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. On the one hand, we did talk to people who expressed some sense of discomfort about other people sharing a religious identity or expression or whatever it might be with them. There was a fear, I think, of being proselytized. There was a fear of being viewed as an other in whatever context. What surprised me was the small percentage of those folks and the larger percentage of people who said, even though it's not my tradition, I'm really curious about this. It actually is a way for me to get to know somebody and get to know something about them in a way that I find positive. And so I think your impulse is correct. There are people out there who have concerns, but maybe what that impulse doesn't unearth is that there are other people out there who really appreciate that kind of conversation. And so trying to do it in a nuanced way is the important component.
And there is a kind of hunger for religious literacy that we found in these data. So over 1/3 of our Christian respondents, for example, say that they learned things about other religious traditions from people at work.
Yeah.
And so there's not, especially if you're part of the majority tradition, it's going to be much less likely that you relate to people from minority traditions. If you're part of the minority in the United States, you're going to have to, right? You're going to have to relate to the people from the majority just to get by. But if you're part of the majority, there are not a lot of environments where you're going to get the chance to interact with people, a wide range of people from the minority. And some of the occupations that we studied, like the tech industry, for example, it really surprised us how it's a very international industry. It's very religiously plural, and this was an opportunity for Christians in the U.S. to really get to know people from other traditions, and it really changed them. So I think that's the kind of potential we see.
Is the second part?
Or
can come back.
yeah, we'll come back.
Professors, thank you so much. I was really intrigued by this, and I want to thank you for your research. I'm a student here in the religion department. I'm a grad student, and I also work in the finance industry, so I found it fascinating. If I could, I would just like to very, very affectionately see if I can poke a hole in the methodological approach. And I do this with utmost.
As soon as you said you were religion
Yeah,
and
exactly.
finance, I was like, my heart quickened a little. Yeah.
It has to do essentially with personality psychology. So, for example, individuals that have a high degree of extroversion are more likely to express ideas or share their ideas. And this translates also into religious selection. Like a person who has a more introverted personality, I would think, maybe empirically this could be falsified, but I would think might be drawn to a more ascetical religious tradition where individual relationship to the divine is prioritized, for example. And so I'm wondering if there could be circumstances where you test for, let's say, outgoingness to talk about religion, and the study picks up, oh, X religious group is more or less likely to be outgoing, but in reality, it's a question of the personality types of the individuals surveyed, not of the religious category as a whole. Is that a stumbling block that you think you'll encounter?
I actually love this question, partly
I know.
because I have a social psychology background, so the personality pieces to it are really intriguing. We actually measured personality in this survey.
We did.
And
we
as
had,
it
right,
turns
the big
out,
5 personality types.
as it we measured the big 5, and as it turns out, we found nothing. Which was kind of surprising and kind of dismaying. Like, we were hoping to get more, but the reason we're not reporting it is because there was really no data to share.
Okay, I want to go over here and yes, Kathy.
I wondered to what extent remote or hybrid workers were in your survey samples, and to the extent they were present, how these findings related to remoteness.
Are you looking at me?
You're just nodding. I've talked a lot. You can.
Yeah, so we have 2 waves of data collection. So we started this study in 2018, and then this is like the social scientist, right? Like, how do you cope with a pandemic? You study it. So we went back to our foundation and we're like, hey, please give us more money. So now we want to study like what's happening to people as a result. I mean, it was just a horrific time. What's happening to work, what's happening to religion in the workplace. And we found a number of things, but 2 that I'll mention here is that people who were especially likely to be discriminated against, so minority traditions, some of that went away during the pandemic because people are at home and they're not interacting with people as much. Another finding that really struck us is that people really drew on the resources of their religious organizations. So people who were part of religious organizations did better with work and the kind of difficulties of work that the pandemic posed for people in terms of driving people home and needing to deal with childcare, for example, and things like that for frontline workers. A lot of religious organizations really stepped in these kinds of times. So there was sort of like a pro-institution kind of perspective that came out in the data, but also sadly, for those who felt discriminated against, it saddened us that, like, leaving the workplace seemed to be one of the answers. Were there other things you guys wanted to
The
mention?
only thing I would add to that is that even the first survey, which was done in 2018, we did a panel survey, so it was representative of the U.S. population, and we did have people who were working remotely. Generally speaking, the data on remote workers is that they have lower job satisfaction and lower organizational commitment than their working from the office peers. I don't know that we actually looked at their religiosity or religious expression. My guess would be it would also be lower for a couple of reasons, partly because we ended up with a correlation between religious expression and job satisfaction and commitment, but also because when you're working remotely, you don't have the opportunities for those water cooler conversations, those kind of social lubricant kinds of ways and places that expression might be exhibited. And so it's just, you're doing the work and that's kind of it. But that's what makes people not like their jobs sometimes too. And so it's again, this double-edged sword kind of component.
Yeah, I was going to add that, like, yeah, there's nothing methodologically that would have not had virtual or remote workers in our sample. So they would have, because we didn't sample based off workplaces necessarily. It was just a general sample. But it is really, and you just said, I don't think we actually looked at this, but
Yeah.
it would be really interesting, like what
We're going to
what
go
is,
back and do that now.
yeah, what does religious expression at work on Zoom mean? I don't know, like,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what that would equate to, but that would be a really interesting thing to think about. Okay.
In the blue hair. Oh,
That's
yes,
you.
you.
I'm interested in the workplace accommodations. Is it just for minority religions or majority? And does it make one feel other to say, you can go in the corner and pray if you want?
It's a great question. Really
It
practical.
probably depends on how it's practiced in terms of whether it makes somebody feel othered. So you can provide an accommodation that could make somebody feel welcome, and you could provide the same accommodation in a way that would make that person feel othered. There's a difference between saying you can go in the corner versus we have this place set aside for you, you can keep your mat there, kind of thing. In terms of what kinds of accommodations are required, essentially the law requires accommodation for religious practice to the extent that it is reasonable. And so this notion of reasonable accommodation applies across any number of factors that are protected by law. So that includes religion, but it also includes disability and other kinds of functions. So organizations are required to provide accommodation to employees to the extent that it doesn't interfere with the practice, the business practice in an unreasonable way.
And it wouldn't just be like minority religions.
Right.
It would any religion. Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow, there's so many hands. Okay, here.
I'm very curious about what your purpose was in doing this, and in the process, did you feel that you became part of that calling?
That's a great question.
That is a good
That's
question.
a really good question. Yeah, so I have, as a scholar, done a lot of work on the scientific community and tried to understand the extent to which religious scientists feel discriminated against, the extent to which there are scientists who are religious, those kinds of issues. And so I was just excited at the possibility. Denise and I actually met at a conference, excited about the possibility of studying people from other types of work outside of science and the science and technology industries. And so that was a wonderful experience. In terms of how I was changed through doing this research, if that's kind of an edge to your question, I felt really fortunate that I do the kind of work that I do, a kind of work that it's very easy to feel called to. I feel very much called to my work as a professor and as a researcher and writer and leader of an institute. And people felt called to work and jobs that are so much harder than my job. And we had this really winsome interview with a man who really did some of the hardest work I can imagine in a hospital, cleaning up some of the things that you would not even want to talk about. And it just, I remember Denise and I, when we listened to the interview, just like crying because the way that he felt called to his work and the kind of ways that he was protecting his patients through the work that he did in janitorial services was incredibly inspirational. And the kind of ways that he was discriminated against as well, just, put my entire life in perspective. So those are the kind of things that, happen to you when you do this kind of research with people.
Yeah, and I would agree with Elaine in the sense that I've always felt called to my work before we got to this project. I would say that the way that this project has shaped me has been in terms of thinking through those various quadrants. And so some of them are easier for me to engage and to understand my work in a sense of meaning in that area. And so thinking through how could I extend that sense of meaning in the other quadrants as well has been useful for me to kind of think through.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I'm gonna now start sweeping into the middle section. We're gonna do quadrants. So anyone in this middle section want to ask?
See,
Okay,
man,
we've already heard from you, but how about here?
So, how do you suppose your conclusions would have been different if you had conducted this same survey in the Middle East?
Super interesting. We'd love to do that, actually. If anyone would like to
If
fund us.
anyone has, see, we want lots of things from you for you to rate and review the book and also find us funding for the next study. So, yeah, I mean, I do think it would differ a lot depending on the majority tradition. I mean, the U.S. is really majority Christian. We do have an extensive number of non-religious people and also people who are spiritual but not religious, but still, again, it's going to differ depending on where you are in the country and what industry you're part of, but still, more than 2/3 of the U.S. is Christian from some kind of Christian tradition. And that has a huge impact on how we think about faith in the workplace. And so in a majority Muslim society, that would have a huge impact. So the surrounding religiosity, we noticed, had a big impact.
We actually changed our language a little bit when we talked to people when we were doing interviews. Depending on their faith tradition, we would use different terminology. So, when we were asking some of our Jewish respondents about calling, we would frame it in terms of tikkun olam. And so there were different things that we did intentionally to try to attend to the particular nuances of the religious tradition of the person that we were talking with. And I assume that we would, if we were to do a project like this, which I think would be very fascinating, in another part of the world, we would need to be attentive in those ways as well. I don't know what the responses would be, which I think it would be really fascinating to kind of explore. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
We know, from just the work on religion science, right, that we've done some cross-national studies on religion science attitudes, and it can be very different depending on what context, cultural, national context you're talking about. And I would expect the very same thing about faith at work.
That's right.
So I have a question. You did provide a very compelling data you said 52% of evangelical Protestant workers says they're motivated to talk about their faith with people at work, a much higher percentage than in any other religious tradition. So do you think, and I just want y'all's expertise on this, do y'all think that they're motivated to talk about their faith because it's a core tenet of what they believe of evangelism plays a key role in sharing the gospel, not just through their life, but in any area they find themselves? And do y'all think if they weren't able to talk about their faith, they might feel marginalized in a way?
Yes.
Yes, and boy, you're getting at the core issues, right? So, what happens and what do you do as a leader in an organization where one person's expression of faith then potentially marginalizes other people? And that's really where the rubber meets the road. And, you'll be the judge of how you use these data, but one thing we want you just to start pondering is, is the answer always to shut down discussions about faith? So what leaders have traditionally done is when those kinds of difficulties happen, well, let's not do this. Let's not have people talk about their faith. Let's try really hard to keep these kinds of things private. And we're just trying to challenge that paradigm a bit. But you're really hitting the core issues. Yeah. But it's comically when we just given some presentations to different kinds of organizations, and we gave a presentation to a large group of evangelical Christians. And again, those in the room were like, what? Only 52% want to talk about their faith? What are we doing wrong with those other 48%? It was very funny.
Okay. Yes.
Aru? Yeah.
In the study, was there any difference how people responded if they were an American-born citizen versus a naturalized citizen versus somebody here on a work visa?
That's really interesting. It's another thing where I don't think we actually look too much at that, but that would be a very natural, if there's any students who need a research topic, that would be a very natural thing to do with these data is to look at that. So.
I see some students in the room smiling, so I think we may have takers.
Yeah.
Okay, can I just have others who haven't asked a question first, and then we can come back? Okay, yes, please, right here.
Thank you. I'm curious about the title you chose for the talk tonight, and it may be the title of the book too. Responding to religion in a changing workplace. I'm curious about the word changing workplace. It might not be a data point, but what is changing in the workplace that interested you all in tying it to religion?
Well, religion is changing in the workplace, and part of that's just a demographic change in the United States. So we're seeing two things that are happening at the same time. One is a decreasing percentage of Americans saying that they affiliate with a religion. So we're increasing the number of nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who say, I don't have a religion. That number is increasing, or that percentage is increasing.
Not N-U-N-S.
Right, N-O-N-E-S, I want to be very clear. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in religious pluralism, and part of that is a function of immigration and other things where we're seeing an increasing percentage of folks from historically minoritized religions, so Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, all of those things we're seeing more of. So as we're seeing both of those changes at the same time, we thought it was really important to kind of attend to what does that mean for an organizational leader? How do you manage in the context where you've got people who are kind of spreading across the religious landscape? And what does that imply for the ways that you manage folks who, many of whom have a strong identity connection to their religion? And so what does that look like in the workplace?
And then we have changes in the workplace itself, which are being affected by these changes in religion, right? So we have an increasing number of younger workers, especially post-pandemic, who feel a sense of burnout. We have people being more likely to transition the types of work they do over the course of their careers, less loyalty to one organization for a long period of time. So there's more desire to have work that feels meaningful and that you can feel called to rather than just work to make money. So there's these changes in how we do work, and especially how younger people want to work, which then are meeting these religious demographic changes. And so we became very interested in how all of that works out.
Wow, so many questions. Okay, you've already asked a question, so I hope you don't mind if I go here. Yes.
As more organizations are accommodating belonging in the DEI equation, did you find any differences with organizations that are including belonging in their DEI stance?
Meaning how, to what extent you feel like you belong in the work?
A lot of organizations are
DEIB kind of thing.
to the
Okay.
DEI
I see what you're
platform.
saying. I see what you're saying.
Because we were asking individuals, we weren't really assessing at an organizational level. We could get at that maybe indirectly with a few people, but it wasn't systematic in any way. So I really don't know that we can speak to it directly. It does seem to me, kind of in theory, that to the extent that an organization is focusing on that belonging piece, they are more likely to be attentive to religious identity. But because we didn't actually talk to the organizations, we were getting all of that filtered through employees in ways that we just aren't sure could answer that question.
Yeah.
We did, or you all did, but I was
You
the
were part of it,
interviewer.
yes.
So I did plenty of these interviews, so I'm always like, oh, I want to add in this story or this person I interviewed. But we did ask people about if they'd had any trainings related to diversity in the workplace, and if religion is ever part of those trainings. And almost no one said that religion had ever been discussed in these types of trainings, which I think is a huge missed opportunity, and also ignores, as you all have been arguing, the fact that identities are often interconnected. And we also interviewed non-religious people, so a non-religious identity is also
Is an
often
identity.
very important for people. And so how you talk about that and address that in the workplace, I think is really important. So, the big takeaway is that we actually do need, as you've been arguing, we do need to take religion seriously in relation to these wider conversations about diversity and belonging in the workplace. So that's a very important point. Okay, I'm gonna go here to the last question. I'm sorry to wrap this up so quickly, but I hope that you'll stick around afterwards and talk to our esteemed authors, and also that you will get your book. We have signed copies of the book available for you, and that is just a token of this fascinating research, a token of our thanks to you, and want to thank the authors. So final question. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Over 15,000 people polled. that to me sounds like a high percentage of willingness. How many people didn't want to answer the poll? Like, did you find that of the, let's say you asked 20,000, you had 15,000 people say yes. To me, that is a number that says people are wanting to talk about this. So I was just wondering what that sort of back end number.
Who didn't answer? Was the
How willing were people wanting to ask?
So it's a little bit of a complicated question because we did this in partnership with Gallup. Gallup has these panels of people who have said, we agree that we will participate in surveys. So they're pre-selected in some sense. With the group that they went to, our response rate was almost half. So it's a very high response rate, but it's a pre-selected panel.
So of the panel, 50% of the panelists, so there were 30 people approved and
Exactly. 30,000 people they went to, and we got over 15,000 respondents.
that's interesting.
The non-respondents is like a perpetual concern and fear of all social science, right? And so like usually what we do is kind of compare. You do various comparisons of like demographics because we already know some things about the 30,000. We can kind of see, okay, well, how does the 30,000 compare to the 15,000? And are they disproportionately different in some ways?
Yeah.
Which was the benefit of working with an organization like Gallup is you would have that kind of what we call non-respondent demographic information. And I love that we're ending on a technical question.
Yes.
That is awesome. That is awesome. This is like a real academic lecture right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yes,
This is really
thank you,
terrific.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
And please rate and review the book. And also, yes, just join me again in celebrating these scholars and researchers and authors on the launch of this book.